I'd like to continue this conversation now with Richard Goldberg, Senior Advisor for Foundation for Defense of Democracies and former Director for Countering Iranian Weapons of Mass Destruction for the White House National Security Council. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time. First, I want to talk about these talks, hostage talks, negotiation talks. They ended inconclusively. Do you think any progress was made?
Well, we're not hearing of any progress at the moment. Hamas's responses are somewhat extreme, saying that they will not negotiate at all unless part of the condition of any talk is that Israel will withdraw its military forces from Gaza. And that's obviously not going to happen. You just heard from your reporter, there's two missions here. One is to destroy Hamas in Gaza. The other is to get the hostages home. They're not going to give up on one or the other. And so I think it's interesting the talks have shifted from Doha, Qatar. They're now taking place in Cairo, Egypt. The Egyptians are now stepping up their role in this process as the IDF comes closer to Rafah, that border community with Egypt. But I think ultimately there's a question of whether or not Hamas believes the international pressure on Israel to stop short of Rafah will succeed, and therefore they don't have to negotiate. And the other possibility that terrorist mastermind you saw in those videos, Yahya Sinwar, is he running around underneath those tunnels so much? Is he cut off from some of the people who are negotiating through the Egyptians and the Qataris that they don't actually know what he wants? And they're providing pretty strong responses because they're afraid that if he ever finds out what they negotiated, he wouldn't be happy.
You know, and you're absolutely right. There are so many unknowns here. When it comes to the talks, what do you think it will take to see some positive movement?
I think the only hope that we have is that Yahya Sinwar is in communication with his people, that they do believe that Israel is going to move on Rafah, that there will be U.S. support for that move, and that his days are numbered in control of Hamas. That would be the only motivation for him to finally come off an extremist position and to negotiate some sort of short-term ceasefire that allows him to regroup. His only hope, remember, is that a short-term ceasefire turns into a long-term ceasefire, and therefore he survives, Hamas survives. The Israelis at this point are trying to avoid that from happening because they want to see the war come to its conclusion, and the objectives being to destroy Hamas and to kill Sinwar. So we do have a bit of a contradiction here. The question is whether or not you can talk Sinwar into believing that it is his 11th hour and his only play is to make a deal and hope that a short-term ceasefire becomes a long-term ceasefire.
You know, so speaking of ceasefire, Richard, the U.S., we know, ahead of these talks, was pushing for that 6 week ceasefire. We did see a pause in fighting. It was back in November, but it was just for 1 week, and that was 3 months ago. Do you think 6 weeks is overly ambitious?
No, I don't think so. From everything I've heard from the Israeli side, they're willing to undertake a 6 week ceasefire so long as it does not take the option of restarting military options off the table. Now, I think that's ambitious. There will be a lot of international pressure and U.S. pressure brought to bear not to restart those operations. But at the same time, the domestic mood in Israel is to finish off Hamas. And this is across the political spectrum, not just Prime Minister Netanyahu or his government, but we're talking about people in the center, people on the left, all wanting to see the IDF complete the operation. One data point to remember, Israel has lost more than 200 soldiers now in the fighting in Gaza. They all have family members as well. They all have loved ones left behind. And there is also a sentiment of finishing the job for their sacrifice. So you have that in addition to the emotions going on over the hostage deal and those families who want to see their loved ones come home.
How important is the pressure right now from the U.S., from other nations? Is it having any influence when we see then that the talks end kind of inconclusively?
Well, I think one thing to reconsider is whether or not there is enough pressure on Hamas. A lot of the pressure publicly is aimed on Israel to make concessions, Israel to pause before they go into Rafah, Israel to rethink their strategy, agree to a ceasefire. There is a potential here that Hamas sees that, and it actually backfires in the talks. They're emboldened by that. They think, why should we do any deal with Israel? Israel's going to be reined in by Western powers, including the United States. One thing to think about is to start sending the opposite signal, that the U.S. and other powers will support Israel in going into Rafah and finishing off Hamas. That might have a different result at the negotiating table very quickly.
What do you think happens next?
Well, I think absent any sort of deal, the Israelis are going to move forward with a pretty comprehensive plan to evacuate civilians out of Rafah. That's very important. There's more than 1 million civilians that moved south during the war that have taken refuge there. The Israelis, in order to minimize civilian casualties, have to find a way to get as many people who want to leave out of there safely and still supported by humanitarian relief. This is a very dire situation for them. Once they have that facilitated and start evacuating civilians, you'll see the IDF do what they've done in Khan Yunis before it, in central Gaza and northern Gaza before that. And that is first encircle Rafah and then start creeping into the central areas of the city until they collapse Hamas control and then start working their way through the tunnel infrastructure.
All right, Richard Goldberg, thank you so much for your time.
You bet.